Under London's damp grey sky, Linah Keza. 29 smiled brightly for the camera at AMC agency. She was the image of success, a beautiful model who had participated in Miss Africa, described by friends as kind, wonderful, and professional. Her life was filled with glamour and dreams on the verge of coming true. However, behind that brilliant picture was a darkness named David Gikawa, an ex-boyfriend who once made her feel safe, but now made her so scared she couldn't breathe. From subtle, controlling gestures, David escalated to violence, beatings, strangulation, and threats with a knife, turning Keza's every day into a constant nightmare. On the night of July the 31st, 2013, the darkness swallowed a small apartment in Leighton. 3 knife wounds tore through the silence in front of her 2-year-old daughter, and a horrifying question arose. How could love turn into such a bloody tragedy? In late July 2013, a light rain fell on the streets of Leighton, East London, where damp red brick walls and the smell of leaves mingled with the sounds of children playing from the apartments. Amidst the bustling streets, Linah Keza stepped out of her small apartment with her long hair still wet and a radiant smile on her face. Keza, 29, lived her life to the fullest, but without pretense. She walked with purpose, yet her eyes were sensitive, observing her surroundings. When she smiled and greeted her neighbors, she wasn't just being charming. Every gesture reflected her kindness and concern for others. Despite her busy career as a model at AMC agency and her past participation in Miss Africa, Keza still dedicated time to her church and charitable activities. This balance of ambition and kindness made her incredibly appealing to everyone, including David Gikawa. Keza and David first met at a mutual friend's party. David, 38, originally from Kenya, was elegant and charismatic. He made an impression with his calm confidence, warm smile, and witty but subtle conversation. Keza was drawn to the delicacy in how he listened, how he observed every small detail around him. In turn, David noticed Keza's strength mixed with grace. The way she observed her environment and smiled at others while maintaining a cautious look in her eyes, a sign of her intelligence and sensitivity. Their mutual curiosity led them to spend a lot of time talking at the party. They shared hobbies, social concerns, and personal experiences. The chemistry in their short conversations and small gestures of care made both realize an unusual connection, a sense of safety and harmony they rarely found in others. Within a few weeks, the relationship blossomed. Weekend walks, romantic dinners, and detailed care messages made Keza believe she had found a reliable life partner. David seemed perfect, considerate, knew how to make her laugh, and showed subtle care. Keza was immersed in these moments of happiness, feeling safe for the first time in years. But over time, a few small details began to cause her slight unease. A casual, sarcastic remark, a stare that lingered too long, or subtle controlling gestures in conversations. Just small details, but enough for a sensitive person like Keza to feel something was off. It wasn't immediate violence or anger, but a creeping sense of discomfort in every moment, a question about her safety and trust. The seemingly perfect trust slowly began to waver. The romantic relationship now harbored hidden dangers, signaling a subtle but heavy conflict gradually forming in her life. The love between Linah Keza and David Gikawa, which began with such attraction and harmony, quickly revealed its complex layers. David, who initially made Keza feel safe with his subtlety, humor, and care, gradually exposed his sophisticated, controlling, and jealous behaviors. He monitored every small aspect of her life, from her friends and daily routines to seemingly simple personal choices. Over the years, their relationship went through continuous fluctuations. Sweet moments were interspersed with sarcastic remarks, lingering stares, or subtle domineering gestures. Gradually, David's behavior escalated from subtle control to direct threats and violence beatings, attempts to strangle her, and even threatening Keza with a knife during conflicts. Each time, Keza felt her fear increase, but she remained calm, trying to maintain a sense of safety and protect herself. By June 2013, after a long period of endurance, Keza decided to end the relationship. But David did not accept her leaving. He began to stalk her, texting with an implied tone and trying to sneak into her life through sophisticated controlling behaviors. The small details, a look that lasted too long, a casual reminder, a call or text with a possessive tone gradually created a continuous state of tension. Keza proactively sought to protect herself. She contacted the police to report the harassment, recorded threats in the Ugandan language, and sought legal advice to obtain the necessary legal measures. She did everything she could to document evidence and maintain her safety. However, David still proved his sophisticated and brazen ability to control. On July 30th, he called the police directly, asking to be escorted into Keza's house to retrieve his belongings, an act that was both audacious and full of possessiveness. This action was not just an invasion of privacy, but also a reminder that, even as Keza was trying to protect herself, David could still find ways to impose his control and intrude into her personal space. Every detail, whether small or large, was like a link in a silent, tense network that Keza had to endure. The risk factors: a history of violence, a repeating pattern of control, threats, and sophisticated possessiveness were noted by the police, but were not enough to prevent the danger. She knew the risks, but her vigilance only kept her in a constant state of tension, making every step and every daily decision a careful calculation. All these factors, the constant fear, the harassment, and David's sophisticated and brazen control, created an ultimate tension in their relationship. On the night of July 31st, that tension reached its peak. David appeared at Keza's apartment at the fateful hour, carrying a kitchen knife, a weapon she had repeatedly warned the police he was capable of using, with no more warnings or opportunities for negotiation. The subtle controlling behaviors of the past transformed into direct violence. In a brief moment, David stabbed Keza 3 fatal times in her chest and abdomen. Each knife wound was not just an act of physical assault, but also the realization of the emotional threat that had existed for years: absolute control, complete possession, and unlimited brutality. The most heartbreaking detail is that the incident happened right in front of Keza's 2-year-old daughter. The small child had to witness the entire horrifying scene: the screams, the blood, and her mother's extreme fear. This event not only left deep psychological trauma, but also proved the unimaginable level of violence David was capable of. The screams echoed through the hallways and streets, attracting the attention of neighbors. Some quickly called the police, and law enforcement arrived at the scene, only to find Keza collapsed in a pool of blood, the fatal wounds having taken her life. Paramedics immediately took Keza to the hospital, but her injuries were too severe, and she had lost too much blood to survive. At the scene, police seized the murder weapon, along with crucial evidence, meticulously documenting every detail of the apartment to reconstruct David's actions. Keza's death was immediately determined to be a consequence of intimate partner violence, not a spontaneous or random act. It was the result of a long process of escalating violence, from subtle control to direct threats, physical violence, and the use of a weapon. The case quickly shocked the African community in London and attracted media attention. What made the tragedy particularly heartbreaking was not just the brutality of the crime, but the fact that Keza had tried everything to protect herself. She called the police multiple times, recorded threats, sought legal intervention, and carefully documented every detail related to David's behavior. All these efforts showed that she was clearly aware of the danger, but the protection system was not strong enough to stop it. Immediately after the murder, the London Metropolitan Police launched an investigation with maximum urgency. the grave nature of the case, combined with the history of interactions between the victim and the perpetrator, made it a top priority for law enforcement. The tension within the community and media attention also put significant pressure on the investigators, forcing them to deploy comprehensive, detailed, and cautious investigative measures. David Gakawa was quickly identified as the main suspect. He was arrested at the scene after police arrived at Linah Keza's apartment. Keza's previous multiple reports to the police about David's harassment, threats, and sophisticated controlling behavior solidified the hypothesis that this murder was not a spontaneous act, but the inevitable consequence of a deliberate process of escalating violence. The investigation was launched from multiple angles to prove that David Gakawa had consciously planned the brutal act, not acted in a moment of temporary anger. Investigators focused on collecting physical and digital evidence, witness statements, police records, and forensic details from the scene to fully reconstruct the sequence of events leading to the murder. Physical evidence was collected first and played a central role. The kitchen knife used to stab Keza 3 fatal times was seized at the scene. Blood traces, fingerprints, and other objects around the apartment were carefully examined to determine the sequence of the perpetrator's actions, from entering the apartment to each fatal stab. This evidence not only proved the direct criminal act, but also demonstrated the deliberate brutality and calculation of David. Digital evidence played the next important role. Keza had previously saved audio recordings of the threats in the Ugandan language, along with a history of text messages and calls from David, all of which were handed over to the police. These materials not only demonstrated David's possessive and controlling behavior, but also showed the frequency and persistence of his threats. These recordings became clear evidence that the murder was not a random act, but the result of a process of escalating violence. Witness statements were also crucial. Keza's friends, family, and neighbors provided detailed accounts of the tense situation she had to endure in the time leading up to the murder. They recounted how Keza had repeatedly expressed her fear, anxiety about personal safety, and the measures she had tried to take to protect herself, from contacting the police to seeking legal support. These testimonies painted a vivid picture of the continuous psychological pressure Keza had to endure, while also proving that the perpetrator had a history of continuous and systematic threats. Police records were meticulously reviewed, including the history of her distress calls and previous reports of harassment and violence. These documents showed that although Keza had repeatedly sought help, the protection system was not strong enough to prevent the danger. The analysis of police records not only helped to strengthen the evidence for prosecution, but also raised serious questions about how law enforcement agencies had handled the previous reports. The eyewitness at the scene, Keza's 2-year-old daughter, also became a key factor in the investigation. Her presence at the time of the murder was noted not only for its legal significance, but also for the psychological impact of the event. The sight of a child witnessing her mother's murder directly increased the gravity and brutality of the case and highlighted the serious nature of domestic violence and the long-lasting consequences for victims and their families. During the investigation, a typical domestic violence pattern emerged. David Gakawa was not a first-time offender or an impulsive actor, but a systematic abuser with a clear history of coercive control, threats, and violence. Investigators discovered that his behavior followed a cycle of escalation from subtle control and possessiveness to indirect threats, then physical violence, and finally, the use of a weapon to coerce and inflict serious injury. This chain of behavior not only confirmed the premeditated nature of the crime, but also reflected the potential danger that Keza had to endure daily. At the same time, the investigation also highlighted the questions: why was a woman who had repeatedly called for help and provided clear evidence of being threatened not effectively? Protected legal experts began to consider the possibility of improving procedures for handling domestic violence reports, while analyzing the shortcomings in data linking. risk assessment, and implementing protective measures before the tragedy occurred. The public and community reaction was strong. Women's rights organizations, the African community in London, and other social groups spoke out, criticizing the justice system for failing to protect Keza. They emphasized that this case was a painful testament to the reality that domestic violence victims are not supported by the system in a timely and effective manner, and called for policy reform, enhanced protective measures, and the establishment of rapid response mechanisms for cases of escalating harassment and violence. The pressure from public opinion, along with the complexity of the case, meant the investigation had to be meticulous and comprehensive. From collecting physical and digital evidence to leveraging witness statements and analyzing police records, the goal was not only to prosecute the perpetrator, but also to shed light on the system's failures to prevent similar tragedies in the future. Investigators recognized that, beyond proving the crime, they also had to provide a complete picture of the gaps in victim protection so that the case could serve as an important lesson for the community and law enforcement agencies. Ultimately, the investigation created a complete, detailed, and highly persuasive legal file. The evidence collected not only clarified the process that led to the murder, but also reflected the resilience and self-protective efforts of Linah Keza during the final weeks of her life. This file became a solid basis for the prosecution of David Gikawa. The trial of David Gikawa took place at the Central Criminal Court of England and Wales, the Old Bailey, in London in 2014, becoming a focal point of public and media attention. The serious nature of the case, the brutal death of Linah Keza right in front of her young daughter, meant every detail was meticulously examined to fully recreate the chain of domestic violence that led to the tragedy. The prosecution, led by Peter Finnegan QC and Eloise Emanuel, argued that the murder was not a spontaneous act, but the inevitable result of a years-long pattern of domestic violence stemming from Gikawa's pathological jealousy and need for control. They presented a detailed account of the years Keza had to live in constant fear, from subtle gestures and lingering stares to verbal threats and direct actions. Each testimony, each audio recording, and each text message was presented as a link in the chain of escalating violence that led to the fateful night of July 31st, 2013, in court. The jury was told about the stress Keza endured in her final weeks. She was constantly worried about her and her daughter's safety, carefully observing every step, every message, and every call from David. The audio recordings of threats in the Ugandan language that she had collected beforehand were played in court, chilling many, as every word reflected a sophisticated, possessive, and threatening intent that could not be considered a random act. This evidence, combined with Keza's history of reports to the police and the legal measures she had sought, highlighted that David Gikawa's actions were deliberate and premeditated. The prosecutor also cleverly emphasized Gikawa's haunting words, "If I can't have Linah, no one can." This statement became a key for the jury to understand the level of possessiveness and the potential danger in the perpetrator's psyche, not stopping at words. The prosecutor presented details of the subtle controlling behaviors and escalating violence, from imposing actions, threats, to physical violence, including beatings, attempted strangulation, and even the use of a knife in previous conflicts. The defense tried to portray Gikawa's actions as an outburst of rage, a personal tragedy that occurred in a moment of uncontrollable emotion. They wanted to mitigate his criminal responsibility, emphasizing that this was not a premeditated act. However, this strategy did not convince the jury. The evidence of prior threats, stalking, control, and escalating violence showed that Gikawa had planned his actions, and Keza had warned of the danger multiple times. Testimonies from Keza's family were presented in a continuous narrative, not just as information, but as a reflection of the victim's fear and anxiety. Her brother recalled daily conversations where Keza shared her worries about David's presence, about her step-by-step efforts to protect herself and her daughter. Her sister recounted how Keza maintained a normal facade in her daily life, hiding the real horror, so that others would not worry and her daughter would be safe. These accounts made the jury understand that Keza lived in a state of extreme tension, where fear was a constant presence. The trial also involved the participation of psychological experts who explained the motivations of domestic abusers. They described Gikawa's behavior as fitting the typical profile of a high-risk abuser: control, possessiveness, threats, and ultimately the potential to cause death. These analyses helped the jury clearly recognize that the case was the inevitable result of escalating violence and could not be considered an accident or a random act. Physical and digital evidence was also presented continuously, reconstructing the entire process from the subtle controlling behaviors, verbal threats, to the direct violence with the knife on the night of July 31st. Each detail was tightly connected, from David's prior actions to his preparation and intent when carrying out the attack, clarifying the level of premeditation and potential danger. After 4 weeks of trial, the jury reached a unanimous verdict: David Gikawa was guilty of murder. The defense's argument of a spontaneous act was completely rejected. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, with a minimum term of 21 years before being considered for parole. The judge emphasized the particularly serious nature of the case, not only because of the brutal violence, but also because it occurred in front of a 2-year-old child. The judge also noted that Keza had done everything she could to protect herself, from seeking police help and recording threats to hiring a lawyer, but still could not avoid the tragedy. The sentence for David Gikawa concluded the criminal phase, but for Linah Keza's family, justice was not yet complete. Punishing the perpetrator was only part of a bigger fight, holding the legal and police systems accountable for the failures that contributed to Keza's death. Immediately after the case, the Independent Office for Police Conduct (IOPC) initiated a 3-year investigation, reviewing the actions and decisions of the police before the tragedy. The results revealed serious shortcomings. Officers failed to collect sufficient evidence, disregarded witness testimonies, and did not prevent Gikawa despite clear grounds. In parallel, Keza's family filed a civil lawsuit against the Metropolitan Police under the Human Rights Act 1998, which led to a settlement with compensation and a formal apology. 6 years later, in 2019, a misconduct hearing determined that 3 officers involved were guilty of serious failures. Adrian Brown and Christopher Moore were found to have made a seriously flawed judgment about Gikawa's danger, while Sidney Rogers was cited for not supervising Gikawa when he came to Keza's house and for providing false information. All 3 received a final written warning, a penalty Keza's family considered too lenient given the deadly consequences. Linah Keza's death became a painful symbol of the system's failures in protecting women from domestic violence, especially Black and minority women. The case was included in domestic violence training programs, emphasizing the importance of early risk identification, intelligence sharing, and enhancing intervention capabilities. Keza's sister, Susan Asimwe, who adopted Linah's daughter, emphasized that while the family blames no one but Gikawa, they believe the police let her down. Their fight is to ensure that justice for one person is justice for all and that no one else has to die like Linah. In criminology, the case demonstrates a typical model of escalating violence from control, threats, and harassment to physical violence and murder. Gikawa's psychology reflects an obsession with control, leading to extreme behavior when his sense of ownership was threatened. Socially, the case raises serious questions about the legal system's responsibility to protect victims, especially when they have repeatedly warned of danger. Linah Keza's legacy extends beyond her personal tragedy. It is a warning about the deadly consequences of domestic violence when it is ignored or poorly handled. Her story calls for comprehensive reform, from police culture to the legal system, so that women in similar situations are heard, believed, and protected. In that small Layton apartment, which once held dreams of a bright future, only the memory remains of a woman who fought until her last breath, but ultimately became a victim of the very system she trusted to protect her.